In this class, we're going to look at human behavior. Now, this is an important element in the Robbins definition, as we'll see in a moment. It's a short class, but there are many important issues brought up in the class that we should be aware of. So let's start with the Robbins definition. Robbins said that economics is a science which studies human behavior as a relationship between ends and scarce means which have alternative uses. Now, in the definition, as you can see highlighted, it studies human behavior. Economics studies human behavior. So it's important that we have some idea of what is meant by human behavior. Now, that may seem like a trivial or an unusual thing to say, but we find that when we look into human behavior and we link it with the idea of science, we get very, very complicated issues arising. And that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at human behavior in the context of science. So therefore, economics is a social science. It looks at people. It studies people and organizations and attempts to make sense of their economic relationships in the world about us. So insofar as economics studies human behavior, it is a social science. It's not a natural science. So let's contrast natural and social sciences. The natural sciences are composed of such disciplines as physics, biology, chemistry, astrophysics, geology. These are the natural sciences. And in contrast to that, we have relationships in the social sciences. And what we need to do is to determine whether it's valid to call these relationships and the study of these relationships, to call them a science. For a start, relationships are much more complex when dealing with people. People are active. They don't want to be predictable. And people have a psychology which differentiates them from the inanimate objects, perhaps of physics or chemistry. In physics, two objects that are perhaps the subject of an experiment, the objects don't have a consciousness. They're just objects. And the scientist is working on the objects and working out relationships. But in economics and in the social sciences, people do have a psychology. They've got cultural variables, and they don't like to be modeled. They don't like to be predictable. So dealing with people is far more complex than dealing with inanimate objects. So in a sense, the natural sciences are much more clear-cut. In general, there are more variables to be taken into account in the social sciences than in the natural sciences. This is why economics is so complicated and why there are so many debates and so many controversies over the recommendations and the conclusions of economic analysis. There are many more variables to be taken into account. Not only the economic variables like price, income and unemployment, inflation, balance of payments, government expenditure and so on, but we also have at the much more personal level, we have the underlying influences that fall behind those. The psychology, as I said. Why do people value goods the way they do? Why do people work in the occupations they do? Why do people want to live in certain areas? Why do people want to get certain qualifications or study certain subjects at university or college? People are very complicated. So it must be therefore the case that economics and the social sciences in general are far more complex and hence more, if you like, unreliable in terms of prediction than the natural sciences. In the natural sciences, once the scientist has found a relationship and can reproduce the experiment under the same conditions and finds the same relationship again, the scientist has discovered something. And that presumably is an immutable law of science that will carry into all time and space. In economics and in the social sciences, we may find a relationship, say as the price of something rises, people buy less of it, but next year that relationship may not still hold. The object of study of the social sciences, as I said, is much more complex than the study of objects in natural sciences. We are influenced by our genetics, by our customs, families and friends, advertising, tastes, fashion trends, education. Many influences on our behavior. So we're very complex characters. We're very complex people. It's difficult to predict this. Whereas in the natural sciences, as I said earlier, objects or compounds in chemistry or whatever it is, they are inanimate. They don't have a consciousness. And they are not out to thwart our discoveries. They're not out to damage our understanding or change their behavior. In economics and the natural sciences, it is the case that people do not like to be predictable. So man is perverse in some respects. We resist predictability. As soon as we become predictable, we change our behavior. That's why we like to buy different goods and we attempt to have different lifestyles. We like to stand out from the rest. So instead of being predictable, it's nigh impossible to predict the behavior of people. So the problem of predictability in the social sciences arises from having to deal with man. And this is why economists and social scientists and many parts of the social sciences have, in a sense, such a bad reputation for predictability. It's very unusual, but we want to be predictable. We want sciences to predict. We want to be able to tell the future almost. And when economists appear on television and say, well, on the one hand, this may happen, but there again, that may happen. Alternatively, it could go this way, or there again, it could go that way. A lot of people think, well, these people are just making it up. They don't know what they're talking about. In fact, what the economist is trying to do is trying to deal with many different possible outcomes that could be adopted by the markets and by people in the markets. So we're not predictable, and maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that means we're human. We're not machines, and we don't want to be machines. There is one group of economists called the Austrian economists who explicitly reject the idea of predictability and say human behavior is far too complex and economics can't be a science. These people emerged in Austria around 1870 and they're known as Austrian economics. Their study is Austrian economics. It's nothing to do with the name of the country. It's nothing to do with Austria. It's just an idea that about the predictability and the way in which markets are seen to operate. And they believe that predictability is not possible within economics. They consider man far too complex to be modelled by mathematical methods. We can't write down our behaviour as an equation and then go away and differentiate it and set it equal to 0 and maximize it or minimize it or whatever. We're not amenable to mathematics. We're not precise. We don't want to be classified in that way. So the Austrian economists reject the scientific approach and instead consider subjective behaviour to be more important. So instead of our objective behaviour, what we're doing and what can be measured and can be seen, they'll look at how we evaluate situations in our minds and what it is that drives the markets, which is our creative minds. So entrepreneurship, for example, can't be predicted. Yet we need entrepreneurship. We need it to get new businesses and new products, to get innovations. But we can't say that entrepreneurship is a function of X, Y, and Z and write it as an equation. So the Austrian economists reject quantification in economics. And therefore, of course, they reject what we call neoclassical economics. Neoclassical economics is really the orthodoxy. This is what you study at undergraduate level right around the world. It seems to be the case that everybody studies neoclassical economics. It's just an accepted way of studying. And many students of economics will spend a lot of time learning mathematics and learning statistical theory, because these are used for prediction purposes. Even though, as the Austrians would say, there are many important functions in economics that can't be predicted. Entrepreneurship, innovation, and yet these are part and parcel of the world in which we live. So there is a big debate here between the people who think we should have prediction within economics and others who say it should not happen. And this all arises because of this element of human behavior in the Robbins definition. We're studying economics as a science, is a social science. It's studying human behavior as a relationship between ends and scarce means, etc. The trick in economics, in neoclassical economics, is to deploy this assumption of ceteris paribus. Now, ceteris paribus means everything else being constant. So when we have a big complex relationship, something depends on many, many aspects. So the price depends on, the quantity demanded, let's say, depends on the price, the income of the people, the tastes of the people, the amount of advertising in the area, and so on. So the quantity demanded is very complex. It depends on many things. In fact, it's far too complex for us generally to handle. So what we do is we use this assumption of ceteris paribus. We hold everything constant and just concentrate on what we want to concentrate on. So we'd say quantity demanded depends on price. Ceteris paribus. Everything else constant. Because man and the economic world in which we live is so complex, we concentrate on simple relationships and ignore the wider influences. So we get round it by saying ceteris paribus. If it's very complicated, make it simple. Ceteris paribus. Of course, it begs the question, well, in the world in which we live, we don't have these ceteris paribus conditions applying. In real markets, the demand will depend on the price, the income, tastes, government pronouncements about the product, expectations about future supplies, branding, marketing strategies. It's complex. That's the world in which we live. But in order to try and find out what's the relationship between demand and price only, then we hold everything else constant. We use this assumption of ceteris paribus. We make economic relationships simple by ignoring everything else. So in this short video, we've looked at human behavior, we've looked at the complexity of human behavior, and we've said that man is extremely complex, and therefore it's very difficult to imagine economics as a science because of the complexity of human behavior, and also the fact that man tends to be perverse. We don't want to be predicted. So that contrasts with, let's say, a physicist working in a laboratory with some objects, and the objects are inanimate. The objects are just sitting there. They're not trying to be perverse and upset the scientist. They're just simply objects in a laboratory. And the scientist will use some equipment and take some measurements and publish a paper, an academic paper, a scientific paper on his or her findings. And the next time the experiment is done, the same findings should emerge under the same conditions. But with economics, people change all the time, and people do not want to be predictable. And then there were the economists called the Austrians who said they agree. So we should not have quantification in economics. We should instead look at subjectivity, and we should look at the way people evaluate economic relationships in their minds. Because that's how the economy works, according to the Austrians. And then we go back to the neoclassical economics, which is the sort of economics that everyone studies at school and at university, which is really based on this idea of science. The Robbins definition: economics is a science which studies human behavior. Economics is a science. So we go back to the Robbins view in neoclassical economics, and we encounter this way of dealing with the complexity, this assumption of ceteris paribus. But it is an assumption. It is just a way of simplifying the complexity of the world in which we live. And that may not be valid, because when we've simplified it, we've moved into a world in which we don't live. We've moved into a very abstract world, a ceteris paribus world. But that's all I'm going to deal with in this class. I'm going to leave it at that and say thank you for watching.